Sometimes the hardest thing to rebuild isn't a broken roof, it's a broken heart. For 52-year-old Wyatt Brenner, life had become small and safe, raising his daughter alone in a mountain cabin where nothing much changed. Then a spring storm tore through his roof, and his daughter Sienna came home with her own heartbreak to mend. Wyatt tried fixing it himself, but he was no handyman. That's when Kaew Kaew arrived, a kind carpenter passing through town who offered to help in exchange for a place to stay. What began as hammering beams became something more. Could 3 wounded souls find healing under one damaged roof? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in the high country carried that particular crispness that comes only in early spring, when winter hasn't quite released its grip, but the promise of warmth lives in every sunrise. Wyatt Brenner stood on his porch with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm in his hands, staring at the gaping hole in his roof where last night's storm had torn through cedar shingles and exposed beams like ribs through torn skin. He'd built this life carefully, quietly, in the 7 years since Caroline died. The cabin sat on 5 acres of pine and Douglas fir, far enough from town that neighbors were a concept more than a reality. Close enough that he could still get groceries and meet with clients when his accounting work required it. It was a good life. A small life, maybe, but good. The coffee had gone cold because he'd been standing there for 20 minutes, trying to calculate in his head whether he could afford a contractor, whether he could manage the repairs himself, whether it even mattered. The cabin had been Caroline's dream. She'd found the property, negotiated the price, overseen most of the renovation work while he juggled spreadsheets and tax returns. She'd had capable hands, his wife, hands that knew how to hold a hammer, plant a garden, deliver a foal when their neighbor's mare went into labor at midnight. His own hands knew keyboards and calculators. They knew how to hold his daughter when she cried, how to sign permission slips and braid hair, poorly but with love. They did not know roofing. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Wyatt turned to see Sienna's sedan coming up the long drive, moving slowly over the ruts and rocks. His heart did what it always did when he saw her, lifted and sank simultaneously. Pride and worry, joy and concern, all tangled together in the complicated knot of loving someone more than your own life. She parked beside his truck and stepped out, and Wyatt felt his chest tighten. She looked thin, not unhealthy but worn down like a stone smoothed by too much rough water. Her dark hair was pulled back in a careless knot, and she wore an oversized sweater that had probably belonged to Devon, though Wyatt suspected she didn't realize it. "Hey, Dad." Her smile was genuine but tired. "Hey, sweetheart." He set down his coffee and opened his arms, and she folded into them like she used to when she was small. She smelled like the lavender soap she'd used since high school, and something else, something sad that had no scent, but he recognized anyway. "I brought too much stuff," she said into his shoulder. "I might have overpacked." "There's no such thing as overpacking when you're coming home." He held her tighter for a moment, then released her. "Let me help you unload." The car was indeed packed full. Suitcases, boxes, a desk lamp, framed photos facing backward so he couldn't see what memories she'd chosen to bring. They worked in comfortable silence, carrying her life back into the cabin, into her old bedroom that he'd kept exactly as she'd left it, though he'd dusted regularly and changed the sheets once a month, just in case. When the car was finally empty, they stood in the kitchen and looked at each other with the careful politeness of people who love each other but don't know what to say. "The roof," Sienna said finally, glancing up at the ceiling. "Yeah, storm came through pretty hard last night. Can you fix it?" Wyatt laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "I can try. Might end up making it worse, but I can try." "Dad." Her voice carried that particular tone that meant she was about to say something true. "You don't have to do everything yourself." "I know. Do you?" He busied himself making fresh coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands. "I'll call around. Get some quotes." "It'll be fine," but they both heard the uncertainty in his voice. That evening, they ate dinner at the old pine table that Caroline had refinished one summer, working on it for weeks until the grain glowed golden in the lamplight. Wyatt had made spaghetti, one of the 3 dishes he could reliably prepare, and Sienna had said it was good, which they both knew was generous. "Do you want to talk about it?" Wyatt asked, pushing pasta around his plate. "Not really." Sienna took a sip of water. "Not yet. That's okay. I just needed to be somewhere that felt like home. Somewhere that made sense," Wyatt nodded. He understood that feeling better than she knew. After Caroline died, this cabin had been both sanctuary and prison. A place where her presence lived in every corner, every carefully chosen detail. Some days that was comforting. Other days it was unbearable. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "Forever if you want." "Your room is your room." "Thanks, Dad." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm going to figure things out. I just need a minute to breathe. Take all the minutes you need." That night, lying in his own bed with the sound of wind whistling through the damaged roof, Wyatt stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things he'd never learned to do. Caroline used to tease him about it gently with love. She'd called him her beautiful, impractical man and kissed his forehead when he'd tried to fix the porch railing and somehow made it worse. He'd always thought there would be time to learn, time to become the kind of man who knew which end of a nail gun to point where, who could identify wood rot by sight, who understood the mysteries of load-bearing walls and proper drainage. But time had a way of running out when you weren't paying attention. And now, here he was, 52 years old, with a hole in his roof and hands that only knew how to calculate other people's depreciation schedules. Down the hall, he could hear Sienna moving around in her room. Unpacking, probably. Trying to fit her life into the smaller container of childhood, even temporarily. He wanted to help her, wanted to fix whatever Devon had broken in her. But he'd learned that you can't fix people. You can only love them and be present and hope that's enough. The wind picked up, and somewhere in the damaged section of roof, something creaked and groaned. Wyatt closed his eyes and tried not to think about how much professional roofing might cost. Tried not to think about the money he'd been setting aside for Sienna's wedding, now sitting uselessly in an account marked Father of the Bride Fund. Tried not to think about how he was supposed to take care of his daughter when he couldn't even take care of a house. Outside, the pines whispered secrets to each other in the darkness. Inside, 2 people who loved each other lay awake in separate rooms, each carrying wounds they didn't quite know how to name, waiting for morning to come and bring with it another day of carefully not talking about the things that hurt most. The roof could wait until tomorrow. Everything could wait until tomorrow. That's what Wyatt told himself as sleep finally came, heavy and dreamless as stone. Morning came with that particular quality of light that makes everything seem possible, even things that probably aren't. Wyatt stood at the base of the extension ladder he'd borrowed from Mrs. Kerrigan 3 miles down the road, looking up at the damaged section of roof with what he hoped was determination, but suspected was closer to dread. "You sure about this?" Sienna stood beside him, coffee mug in both hands, her expression skeptical. Not even a little bit. Wyatt tested the ladder's stability, found it somewhat reassuring. "But I can at least get up there and see what we're dealing with. Take some pictures, maybe. That'll help when I call contractors." "Dad, I know. I'm being careful." He started climbing, and each rung felt like a small betrayal of common sense. Heights had never particularly bothered him, but the older he got, the more aware he became of gravity's indifference to human dignity. Halfway up, he paused to catch his breath and noticed Sienna had her phone out, probably ready to call emergency services. "I'm fine," he called down. "I didn't say anything. You were thinking it loudly." The roof's surface was more damaged than it had looked from the ground. Shingles torn away in great patches, underlayment exposed, and already starting to curl from moisture. One of the support beams had cracked clean through. Wyatt knelt carefully on the intact section and tried to remember anything useful from the home improvement shows Caroline used to watch. He was examining the cracked beam, wondering if it could be reinforced or needed complete replacement, when his foot slipped on wet moss he hadn't noticed. For one crystalline moment, time expanded, and he saw very clearly how this was going to end. Sliding down the pitched roof, tumbling off the edge, landing hard on ground that had gotten considerably farther away than he remembered. His hand shot out and caught the edge of a roof vent, fingers wrapping around the metal collar with desperate strength. He stopped sliding, heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Dad?" Sienna's voice was sharp with fear. "I'm okay. I'm okay." He carefully redistributed his weight, found purchase, worked his way back to safer ground. Coming down, the descent took twice as long as the climb. When his feet finally touched solid earth, his legs were shaking and his hands felt weak as water. Sienna set down her coffee and hugged him hard. "That's it," she said into his shoulder. "You're not going back up there. I need to—" "No, you need to hire someone who knows what they're doing before you break your neck." He wanted to argue, but the truth was, his hands were still trembling, and he'd just had a very clear vision of his own mortality. "Yeah, you're probably right." They were standing there, Wyatt trying to recover his dignity, and Sienna trying not to look as scared as she'd been, when they heard the sound of a truck engine. Both turned to see an old Ford pickup, midnight blue with rust along the wheel wells, coming up the drive. The truck parked beside Sienna's sedan, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe late 40s, with sun-weathered skin and laugh lines that suggested she used them frequently. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, steel-grey threads running through brown. She wore work jeans with actual work stains, boots that had seen real use, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that spoke of physical labor. Her hands, Wyatt noticed, looked capable. "Morning," she said, her voice warm and slightly rough, like honey mixed with gravel. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was driving past earlier, saw you up on that ladder and—" She paused, smiled apologetically. "Well, I'm a carpenter by trade, and I've seen enough people nearly fall off roofs to recognize the signs. Thought I'd circle back and make sure you were all right." There was something immediately disarming about her directness. No pretense, no agenda. Just genuine concern delivered with a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm fine," Wyatt said, though he suspected the shakiness in his voice undermined the claim. "Just assessing the damage." "Assessing is important." The woman walked closer, tilted her head to look at the roof, and Wyatt saw her expression shift into something professional and focused. "That beam's cracked through. You've got water damage in the underlayment and—" She squinted. "Is that a whole section of decking that's compromised?" "I have no idea," Wyatt admitted. "I'm an accountant, not a roofer." She laughed, and it was a good sound. "Nothing wrong with knowing your limits. I'm Faye, by the way. Faye Calloway, Wyatt Brenner. This is my daughter, Sienna. Nice to meet you both." Faye's handshake was firm without being aggressive, her palm calloused in a way that spoke of years holding tools. "Listen, I don't want to overstep, but I'm actually between jobs at the moment. Been traveling around picking up work where I can find it. If you need help with that roof, I'd be happy to take it on." Wyatt felt his pride kick in, that stubborn male instinct that said he should be able to handle his own problems. "That's kind of you, but I'm sure I can find someone local. Get some quotes." "Dad," Sienna said quietly, and he heard the gentle rebuke in her voice. Faye seemed to sense his hesitation. "I'll be honest with you, I'm not just offering out of the goodness of my heart. I'm looking for a place to stay for a week or two. Hotels eat up my travel budget faster than I'd like. So here's my proposal. I fix your roof, you provide room and board. Fair trade, no money changes hands, and you get professional work instead of—" She gestured at the ladder, whatever was about to happen up there. "You want to stay here?" Wyatt felt off balance, like the world had tilted slightly sideways. "If you've got a spare room. If not, I can sleep in my truck. Done it plenty of times." She said it matter-of-factly, no self-pity. "But I do good work, and I'm guessing you need that roof fixed before the next rain." Sienna stepped forward. "We have a spare room, and honestly, watching my dad try to fix that roof himself was taking years off my life. Sienna, Dad, she's a professional. She's offering. Why are we even hesitating?" Faye raised her hands. "No pressure. If it feels wrong, just say so. I'll be on my way, no hard feelings." But something in her eyes, A steadiness, a quiet competence made Wyatt's resistance crumble. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the memory of how close he'd come to sliding right off that roof. Maybe it was something else he didn't want to examine too closely. "Okay," he heard himself say. "If you're serious, then yes." "Thank you." Faye's smile widened. "I'm serious. Let me grab my tools, and we can take a look at what we're working with. I'll need to run into town for supplies, but I can give you a list of what I'll need. Should be able to start this afternoon if the weather holds." She walked back to her truck, and Wyatt watched her go, feeling like he'd just agreed to something that would change more than just his roof. Beside him, Sienna was smiling, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived. "This is good, Dad. This is really good." "Is it?" "Yeah." She squeezed his arm. "Sometimes help shows up exactly when you need it. You just have to be willing to accept it." Faye returned with a worn leather tool belt slung over her shoulder and a measuring tape in hand. And Wyatt thought about Caroline, who'd always said the universe had a way of providing if you paid attention. He'd stopped believing that after she died. But standing here in the morning light, watching this stranger walk toward his broken roof with confidence and purpose, he felt something shift in his chest. Maybe not hope, not yet, but possibility. And for now, that was enough. The hardware store in town was the kind of place that smelled like sawdust and possibility. Faye moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, pulling items from shelves, while Wyatt pushed the cart and tried to understand what half of them were for. "Cedar shingles," Faye said, checking the quality of a bundle. "They'll match what you've already got. Could go with asphalt, cheaper and faster, but cedar ages better up here in the mountains. Breathes right. Whatever you think is best." She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "It's your roof, Wyatt. You get a say. My say is that I trust your judgment." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or appreciation. "Cedar it is, then." They loaded roofing nails, underlayment, flashing tape, a box of brackets that Faye said they'd need for the compromised beam. At the register, Wyatt pulled out his credit card before she could object. "Materials are on me," he said. "That wasn't part of the deal, but it's only fair." Fair enough. Faye didn't argue, which he appreciated. There was a practicality to her that he found refreshing. No false modesty, no games, just straightforward honesty. On the drive back, she told him about the last job she'd done. Little house outside of Bozeman. Family wanted a deck-built pergola over it. The father had drawn up these elaborate plans, showed me pictures from magazines. I told him we could do it, but it had cost about twice what he was thinking. Did he go for it? Nope. Hired some guy off Craigslist who said he could do it cheaper. Faye shook her head, smiling slightly. Drove past 3 months later. The whole thing was already sagging. Some lessons cost more than money. Back at the cabin, Sienna had made sandwiches and set them out on the porch with fresh lemonade. The three of them sat in the morning sun, eating and talking about nothing in particular. The weather, the price of lumber, whether the eagles that nested in the tall pine were back yet this year. Wyatt found himself studying Faye when she wasn't looking. There was something solid about her, something grounded. She held her sandwich with both hands like she was really present for the experience of eating it, really tasting it. When Sienna asked where she was from originally, Faye's face softened. "Vermont. Little town you've never heard of, up near the Canadian border. Taught special education there for 15 years. You were a teacher?" Sienna leaned forward, interested. "Was." Faye took a drink of lemonade. "Life changed. I changed. Been on the road about 3 years now, picking up carpentry work. My husband taught me the trade. He was a contractor. I used to help him summers when school was out." The past tense didn't escape Wyatt's notice. Used to, was. The same language he used when talking about Caroline. The grammar of loss. "Well," Sienna said gently, "we're glad you're here now." After lunch, the real work began. Faye set up the ladder with a confidence Wyatt envied, tested it twice, then climbed up with her tool belt, riding low on her hips. She moved across the damaged section like she'd been born on rooftops, sure-footed and calm. "Hand me that pry bar," she called down, and Wyatt scrambled to figure out which tool was the pry bar. "The one that looks like a bent crowbar," Faye said, not unkindly. He found it, carried it up the ladder, carefully, so carefully, and passed it to her. She took it without comment on how white his knuckles were from gripping the rungs. "You don't have to come up here if you're not comfortable," she said. "I want to help." "Then help! But tell me if it's too much. No shame in knowing your limits." They worked through the afternoon, Faye teaching as she went. How to identify which shingles needed replacing, how to feel for soft spots in the decking, how to check if a beam could be reinforced or needed replacing entirely. Wyatt absorbed it all like a student who'd shown up late to class and was trying desperately to catch up. His hands blistered within an hour. He didn't mention it, but Faye noticed anyway. "Take a break," she said. "Get some gloves from my truck. Blue toolbox behind the driver's seat." "I'm fine." "Wyatt." She fixed him with a look that was firm but not unkind. "Blisters get infected. Infected hands can't work. Get the gloves." He climbed down, found the gloves, work-worn leather that smelled like machine oil and cedar, and pulled them on. They were too small, but they'd do. In the truck bed, he noticed a guitar case, battered and covered in stickers from different states. Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Oregon. A traveling life, documented in adhesive. When he climbed back up, Faye was humming something under her breath. An old tune he half recognized but couldn't name. "You play?" he asked, gesturing toward the truck. "When the mood strikes, you. Not a musical bone in my body. Caroline, my wife, she played piano. Not well, but enthusiastically. Enthusiasm counts for a lot." Faye didn't ask what happened to Caroline, and Wyatt was grateful for that. "Here, hold this steady while I secure it." They worked until the light started to fade, until Wyatt's arms ached, and his back protested, and he'd learned more about roof construction than he'd ever imagined needing to know. When they finally climbed down for the day, Sienna was waiting with cold bottles of water and the news that she'd made dinner. "Nothing fancy," she said. "Just chicken and rice. But there's enough for 3. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easier than Wyatt expected. They asked about his accounting business, seemed genuinely interested in the particulars of small-town tax preparation. Sienna told stories about her marketing job in the city, the campaigns she'd worked on, the clients who'd driven her slowly insane. "So why'd you come back?" Faye asked, and the question was gentle enough that Sienna answered honestly. "I was engaged. It ended badly. I needed somewhere that felt safe while I figured out what comes next." "I understand that." Faye's voice carried recognition, the weight of similar experience. "Sometimes you need to go backward before you can go forward again." After dinner, as the mountain air turned cool and the first stars emerged, Faye retrieved her guitar from the truck. She settled on the porch steps and played old folk songs, some Wyatt recognized and some he didn't. Her voice was untrained but true, and there was something achingly honest about the way she sang. Wyatt sat in the rocking chair Caroline had loved, listening, and felt something in his chest loosen. Something that had been clenched tight for 7 years, so long he'd forgotten it was there. He looked over at Sienna, saw tears on her cheeks reflecting starlight, and understood that she felt it too. This loosening, this careful, cautious opening. When Faye finished the last song, the silence that followed was comfortable, complete, the kind of silence that only exists between people who've started, however tentatively, to trust each other. "Thank you," Wyatt said quietly. "For what?" "For today. All of it." Faye smiled, her face half-shadowed in the porch light. "Thank you for letting me stay. It's been a while since I've had a place that felt like this." "Like what?" "Like home." That night, lying in bed with the sound of Faye's guitar still echoing in his memory, Wyatt realized he'd laughed more today than he had in months, maybe years. His hands hurt, his back ached, and he'd probably be sore tomorrow. But he felt alive. And that, he thought, as sleep pulled him under, was worth any amount of physical discomfort. Rain arrived 3 days into the project, drumming against the windows, with the insistence of an uninvited guest who has no intention of leaving. Wyatt woke to grey light and the sound of water running through the gutters, and his first thought was relief. They'd managed to get tarps secured over the damaged section yesterday evening. Faye insisting they take the extra time, even though they were all tired. "Weather up here doesn't ask permission," she'd said, hammering the last corner tight. Better safe than sorry. Now, standing in the kitchen with coffee brewing and rain streaking the windows, Wyatt was grateful for her foresight. The cabin felt smaller with 3 people trapped inside by weather, but not uncomfortably so. Cozy, maybe. Like the walls had drawn in closer to keep them safe. Sienna emerged from her room wearing sweatpants and one of her mother's old sweaters. Wyatt recognized it immediately, felt his heart squeeze. She'd found it in the hall closet, probably. He'd kept Caroline's things, unable to part with them, telling himself he'd sort through everything eventually. Eventually had become 7 years. "Morning," Sienna said, then stopped, looking down at the sweater. "Is this okay?" I should have asked. "It's fine, sweetheart. It looks good on you." She poured herself coffee, and they stood together listening to the rain. Faye appeared a few minutes later, hair wet from a shower, looking more rested than Wyatt had seen her yet. "Forced day off," she announced. "The roof gods have spoken. What do people do on forced days off?" Sienna asked, smiling slightly. "Well, in my experience, they drink too much coffee. Tell stories they wouldn't normally tell, and maybe bake something if the mood strikes." I could get behind that plan. They migrated to the living room, where Wyatt built a fire in the stone fireplace, one thing he actually knew how to do competently. The flames caught and grew, pushing back the grey dampness of the day. Outside, the rain intensified, and inside, the 3 of them settled into a comfortable arrangement. Sienna curled up in the corner of the couch, Faye took the armchair, and Wyatt claimed the ottoman near the fire. "My mother used to make cinnamon rolls on rainy days," Sienna said suddenly. "I wonder if we have the ingredients." She went to investigate, and Wyatt heard her opening cabinets, the sound of glass jars being moved around. When she returned, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she was holding a small wooden recipe box. "I found this," her voice wavered. "Mom's recipes. Her handwriting." Wyatt stood, went to her, but before he could say anything comforting or useless, Faye spoke. "May I see?" Sienna handed her the box, and Faye opened it carefully, with the reverence of someone who understands that some objects are more than just objects. She pulled out a card, read it, smiled gently. "My husband used to write recipes down," Faye said quietly. "His mother's, mostly. Things she'd made when he was growing up. After he died, I found them all in a folder in his workshop. Flour dusted and stained with vanilla extract." She looked up at Sienna. "It hurt to read them, but it also helped. Does that make sense?" "Yes." Sienna's voice was barely audible. "It makes perfect sense. How long has it been?" Wyatt asked, the question emerging before he could stop it. "Since your husband, 5 years. Faye handed the recipe box back to Sienna with care. "Heart attack. Sudden. One morning he was kissing me goodbye, heading to a job site. By noon he was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. Just honest. The kind of silence that holds grief without trying to fix it. "Cancer," Wyatt said. 7 years ago. We had time to say goodbye, which was both a blessing and a curse. Every day watching her fade, knowing what was coming, powerless to stop it." Sienna wiped her eyes. "I was 22. Still in college. I came home and—" She stopped, shook her head. "Sorry, this is supposed to be a nice rainy day, not a therapy session." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Faye said. "Tell you what, let's make your mother's cinnamon rolls. The 3 of us. We'll tell stories while we bake. Good ones. The kind that make us remember why we loved them." So they did. Sienna read the recipe in Caroline's careful handwriting, and they gathered ingredients, and somehow the kitchen became a place of alchemy. Flour dusted the counters. Faye showed Sienna how to knead dough properly, hands pressing and folding with practiced rhythm. Wyatt melted butter and mixed cinnamon with sugar, following instructions, feeling useful. And they talked. Faye told them about meeting her husband in college, how he'd been the loud one, and she'd been quiet, how opposites attracted and somehow made sense, how he'd proposed during a thunderstorm, both of them soaked to the skin, laughing like fools. Wyatt shared about Caroline's stubbornness. how she'd insisted on learning to ride a motorcycle at 40, how she'd fallen off 3 times before finally getting it right, refused to quit, how she'd ridden that bike right up until the treatment made her too weak, and even then she'd sit in the garage and just look at it. Sienna told stories Wyatt had never heard, things Caroline had said to her during those last months, private conversations between mother and daughter, advice about love, about strength, about not being afraid of joy even after sorrow. "She told me," Sienna said, rolling out dough with careful attention, "that grief is just love with nowhere to go, that it doesn't mean you stop loving. It just means you have to find new ways to hold it." The cinnamon rolls went into the oven, and the cabin filled with sweetness and warmth. They played cards, rummy, which Faye taught them, and talked about easier things. Books they loved, places they wanted to visit, small dreams that felt manageable. When the rolls came out, golden and perfect, they ate them warm with more coffee, and Wyatt thought about how strange it was that grief could sit at the same table as contentment, that you could miss someone desperately and still feel grateful for the moment you were in. "She would have liked you," he told Faye, surprising himself with the admission. "Your wife?" "Yes, Caroline. She would have appreciated your competence. Your honesty." He paused. "Your music." Faye's smile was soft. "I would have liked her too, I think. Anyone who raises a daughter like Sienna and teaches a man like you that it's okay to accept help. She must have been something special." She was. "So was my husband." Faye's eyes were distant for a moment, then focused again. "But they're gone. And we're still here. And that means something, I think. Means we're supposed to keep going, keep building things, keep finding reasons to get up in the morning." Sienna reached across the table and took both their hands. "I'm glad I came home. I'm glad you're both here. I know I've been quiet about Devon, about everything, but watching you two this past week, it's helped. Seeing that people can survive loss and still be whole, still be kind." "You're going to be okay," Faye said with certainty. "It might take a while, but you're going to be more than okay." The rain continued all day, but inside the cabin, wrapped in warmth and flower dust and the lingering sweetness of cinnamon, none of them minded. They told more stories, played more cards. They played guitar again, teaching Sienna a few simple chords, both of them laughing when Sienna's fingers couldn't quite find the right positions. Wyatt watched them, his daughter and this woman who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a question he hadn't known to ask, and felt something shift deeper in his chest, not just loosening now, opening, actually opening. That night, after Sienna had gone to bed and Faye had retired to the guest room, Wyatt stood at his bedroom window and watched the rain. He thought about Caroline, sent her a silent message wherever she was. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't end. Thank you for Sienna. Thank you for this life, even the hard parts." And then, carefully, like a man learning to walk after a long illness, he let himself think about tomorrow. About more days with work gloves and roofing nails and patient instruction. About evenings with guitar music and easy conversation. About the possibility that life could hold more than just survival. The rain whispered against the glass, and Wyatt closed his eyes and listened, and for the first time in 7 years, the sound didn't make him feel alone. The roofwork had reached that satisfying stage where progress became visible. Whole sections now wore new cedar shingles that gleamed golden against the weathered grey of what remained. Faye worked with steady precision, and Wyatt had learned enough to be genuinely helpful rather than just willing. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the past week. Mornings began early, when the mountain air still held its nighttime chill. Coffee on the porch, discussing the day's plan. Then up the ladder, tools in hand, working while the light was good. Lunch around noon, usually something simple that Sienna prepared. More work in the afternoon, stopping when shadows grew long. Dinner together, then music or conversation or comfortable silence until the day released them to sleep. It felt almost domestic, this routine. Wyatt tried not to think too hard about what that meant. On Thursday morning, Faye discovered a bird's nest tucked into the eave they were preparing to repair. She called Wyatt over, and they examined it together, 3 small eggs, pale blue and perfect, nestled in a careful construction of twigs and moss. "We'll have to move it," Faye said, but her voice was reluctant. "Can we? Will the mother come back?" "If we're careful. If we don't handle the eggs directly, and we don't move it too far." She looked at the surrounding trees, calculating.
"That branch there?"
"Similar height, good protection. It might work." They spent an hour on the delicate operation. Faye cut a section of board to slide beneath the nest, supporting it completely. Wyatt held the ladder steady while she climbed down with painstaking slowness. The nest balanced like precious cargo. Together they secured it in the nearby pine, using wire to hold the board stable against the trunk. "Think she'll find it?" Wyatt asked. "We'll see. Birds are smarter than people give them credit for." Sienna had watched the whole operation from below, and when they finished, she surprised Wyatt by pulling out her phone and showing them photos she'd taken. Good ones, the nest in Faye's hands, Wyatt's careful attention, the final placement. Angles and lighting that showed she hadn't lost her eye for composition, even if she'd lost her way in other areas. "These are beautiful," Faye said, scrolling through them. "You've got real talent." "Had. I worked in marketing, not art. Talent doesn't go away just because you put it aside." Faye handed back the phone. "My husband used to say that creative instincts are like muscles. They atrophy if you don't use them, but they remember. They come back." Sienna looked at the photos again, something shifting in her expression. Maybe they were packing up tools for the day when a car pulled into the drive. An older sedan that had seen better years, driven by a woman who had not. Mrs. Kerrigan emerged with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested every morning, her white hair pulled back in a bun that had probably been fashionable 60 years ago. "Wyatt Brenner!" she called out, her voice carrying remarkable strength for someone so physically diminished. "I've been wondering when you'd return my ladder." "Mrs. Kerrigan?" Wyatt came down from the roof, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm sorry, I should have brought it back already. We've just been... I can see what you've been doing." Mrs. Kerrigan's sharp eyes moved from the roof to Faye and back again. "And who's this helping you?" "This is Faye Calloway. She's a carpenter." "Faye, this is Mrs. Kerrigan, my neighbor. 3 miles hardly makes us neighbors, but I'll accept the title." Mrs. Kerrigan extended her hand to Faye, and they shook with the formal courtesy of 2 women assessing each other. "You're doing good work up there." "I can see it from here." "Thank you, ma'am. How long have you been staying?" The question was direct, unapologetic. "About a week and a half." "I see." Mrs. Kerrigan turned back to Wyatt. "Well, it's good to see you accepting help for once. You've been alone in this cabin long enough, stubborn as your father was. A person needs company, needs purpose beyond just surviving." Wyatt felt heat rise in his face. "Mrs. Kerrigan, don't Mrs. Kerrigan me. I'm 83 years old, which gives me the right to speak plainly. Your Caroline was a lovely woman, rest her soul, but she wouldn't want you living like a hermit. She'd want you to..." She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. "Well, she'd want you to be happy. That's all I'm saying." The silence that followed was excruciating. Sienna had frozen on the porch steps. Faye suddenly found something fascinating about the tool belt in her hands. Wyatt wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. "I appreciate your concern," he managed finally. "Good, then appreciate it by bringing my ladder back tomorrow." Mrs. Kerrigan softened slightly. "And perhaps bring your friend with you. I have some fence posts that need replacing, and I suspect she'd do them properly instead of the half job my grandson attempted last summer." "I'd be happy to help," Faye said, recovering her composure. After Mrs. Kerrigan left, the 3 of them stood in awkward silence. Finally, Sienna started laughing, a genuine, unrestrained sound that broke the tension like a hammer through glass. "I'm sorry," she gasped between laughs. "I'm so sorry, but the look on your face, Dad. It wasn't funny." "It was a little funny," Faye said, smiling despite herself. "She basically announced to the entire valley that we're..." Wyatt stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. "That you're what?" Faye's tone was gentle, careful. "I don't know." "That we're something we're not. And what aren't we?" The question hung in the air between them. Wyatt looked at Faye, really looked at her, saw the openness in her expression, the willingness to have this conversation, even though it was complicated and frightening, and neither of them had asked for it. "I don't know that either," he admitted. "Well," Faye set down her tool belt with deliberate care. "When you figure it out, maybe let me know." She walked into the cabin, not angry but not quite relaxed either, and Wyatt stood there feeling like he'd just failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. "Dad!" Sienna came down the steps, put her hand on his arm. "She's not asking you to know everything. She's just asking you to be honest about not knowing. I'm too old for this." "For what? For being happy? For taking a chance? For starting over? For—" He gestured helplessly at the cabin, the roof, the whole complicated situation. "For all of it. You're 52, not 92, and even if you were 92, it still wouldn't be too late." Sienna's voice carried an edge now, frustration mixing with love. "You've been taking care of me my whole life. You put everything aside after Mom died to make sure I was okay. Well, I'm okay now. I'm going to be okay. So maybe it's time you let yourself be okay too." She went inside, leaving Wyatt alone with the lengthening shadows and his own inadequacy. He looked up at the roof, at the work they'd done together. Solid work, work that would last. But roofs were easier than feelings. You could measure a roof, calculate exactly what it needed, follow a clear plan from start to finish. People weren't like that. Especially people who'd already lost everything once and knew exactly how much it cost. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. Not hostile, but careful. Faye helped cook without being asked, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd learned the space. Sienna set the table. Wyatt made salad and tried not to think too hard about Mrs. Kerrigan's words or his own fumbling response, or the way Faye's expression had shuttered when he'd said they weren't anything. Because that wasn't quite true, was it? They were something. He just didn't know what to call it. After the dishes were cleared and Faye had retreated to her room, early, claiming tiredness, Sienna caught Wyatt's arm. "Come with me. I want to show you something." She led him to the attic, up the narrow stairs he hadn't climbed in years. The space was dusty and close, filled with boxes and furniture too good to throw away, but not quite good enough to keep in regular rotation. Sienna went directly to a wooden chest in the corner, the one Caroline had brought from her grandmother's house. "I found these yesterday," Sienna said, opening the lid. "I was looking for old photo albums, but I found something better. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, bundled with string, yellowed with age. Wyatt's handwriting on the envelopes. Caroline's name and their old apartment address from before they were married. I wrote to her when I was traveling for work," Wyatt said, memory flooding back. "She was finishing her degree. I'd taken that contract job in Denver. We couldn't afford phone calls every night, so you wrote letters." Sienna pulled out a bundle, held it carefully. "Can we read them?" "Together." Something in Wyatt's chest clenched and released simultaneously. Yeah, we can." They sat on the attic floor, dust motes dancing in the single hanging bulb's light, and read letters from 30 years ago. Wyatt's younger self spoke from the pages, earnest, hopeful, deeply in love with a woman he was afraid of losing to distance and time. "Listen to this one," Sienna said, her voice thick with emotion. "You wrote, 'I know we're young and everyone says we should wait, that there's plenty of time for commitment and mortgages and all the sensible things. But I've never been good at sensible when it comes to you. I want messy and imperfect and real. I want every day, even the boring ones. Especially the boring ones.'" Wyatt remembered writing that letter, remembered the fear underneath it that Caroline would realize she could do better, that his love was too much or not enough or just not right. "She kept every single one," Sienna said. "And look," she opened another bundle, these in Caroline's handwriting addressed to Wyatt, her letters back. She saved them too. They read for an hour, trading letters back and forth. Young love captured in ink and paper, dreams and doubts and small daily observations. Caroline writing about her psychology classes, about the cat she'd rescued, about missing Wyatt's terrible cooking and worse jokes. Wyatt writing about job sites and hotel rooms and counting days until he could come home. "They were so young," Sienna said finally, "so uncertain about everything except each other. We figured it out as we went. Made mistakes. Fixed most of them. Did you ever regret it? Marrying young, settling down? Never. Not once. Wyatt set down the letter he'd been holding. Your mother and I, we grew up together. Grew into the people we became, side by side. That's a gift, Sienna. Not everyone gets that. But you could have it again. Not the same way, but... She stopped, chose her words carefully. Dad, Mom would want you to be happy. She told me that, actually. When she was sick. Made me promise I'd tell you someday that it was okay to move on. That loving someone new didn't mean forgetting her. Wyatt's eyes burned. She said that. She said you'd probably wait too long. Said you'd be loyal to a fault, noble and stubborn and completely maddening. Sienna smiled through tears. She knew you pretty well. I miss her. I know. So do I. Sienna took his hand. But she's not here, and Faye is. And I see the way you look at her, Dad. I see the way she looks at you. And I see two people who've both been alone too long, both been hurt too badly, both afraid to take another chance. It's complicated. Love is always complicated. That's not an excuse. They sat in silence, surrounded by ghosts made of paper and ink. Finally, Wyatt spoke. What if I mess it up? What if I'm too old, too set in my ways? What if she realizes I'm not worth the trouble? What if you're perfect for each other and you never find out because you were too scared to try? The simplicity of it hit him like cold water. All his rationalizations, his careful distance, his determination not to impose or assume, it was all just fear dressed up in courtesy. Oh, when did you get so wise? He asked. I had good teachers. Sienna stood, brushed dust from her jeans. Come on. I think there's someone you need to talk to. But when they came down from the attic, Faye wasn't in her room. Wyatt checked the kitchen, the living room, finally saw through the window that she was outside, sitting on the porch steps, guitar across her lap, but not playing. Go, Sienna said, giving him a gentle push. Wyatt walked out into the cool evening, sat down beside Faye, but not too close. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. I'm sorry, Wyatt said finally. For earlier. For being scared? Faye's voice was soft, without judgment. Yes, scared. I'm scared too. She adjusted the guitar on her lap, fingers finding a chord but not strumming. I've been running for 3 years, Wyatt, town to town, job to job, telling myself I was living an adventure when really I was just avoiding the possibility of getting hurt again. And now? Now I'm here. And I'm terrified because this feels different. You feel different. She finally looked at him. But I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being alone. And if I leave when this roof is finished, I think I'm going to regret it for whatever time I have left on this earth. Wyatt's heart hammered. I don't want you to leave. Then what do you want? The question was simple. The answer should have been too. But Wyatt found himself thinking of those letters, of young love and old loss, of Caroline's blessing delivered through their daughter. He thought of the past week and a half, working side by side, sharing meals and stories and music. The way Faye hummed while she worked. The way she listened, really listened when he talked. The way she'd moved the bird's nest with such care. I want more time, he said. I want to see where this goes. If it goes anywhere. If you're willing to stay and find out. Faye's smile was slow but genuine. There's a community dance next Saturday at the town hall. I heard Mrs. Kerrigan mention it. She would. Will you take me? As a proper date, not just... Faye gestured at the cabin, the roof. Not just this arrangement we've had? Yes. The word came easier than he expected. Yes, I'll take you. Good. She strummed the guitar, finally, a simple chord progression that resolved into something sweet and hopeful. Then we have a week to finish this roof and figure out if I'm staying or going. And if you stay, then I guess we figure out the rest as we go, together. Wyatt let himself lean closer, just slightly, and Faye leaned back, not touching yet, but the space between them felt charged with possibility instead of fear. Inside, through the window, Sienna watched them and smiled. The roof was finished by Wednesday afternoon. They stood back and admired their work. Wyatt's first real carpentry project, completed with professional guidance and his own growing competence. The new cedar shingles would weather and grey over time, eventually blending with the old, but for now they stood bright and golden, a visible testament to what could be built with patience and help. "It's a good roof," Faye said, and there was pride in her voice. "Not just in the work, but in him. You did good, Wyatt. We did good." That evening, Sienna made a celebration dinner, pot roast with vegetables, Caroline's recipe, but executed with her own touches. They ate and talked about the dance on Saturday, about what remained to be done around the property, about small future things that assumed Faye would be there to help with them. Thursday morning, Faye drove into town to pick up mail she'd had forwarded to the post office. She'd been gone for about an hour when she returned, and Wyatt knew immediately that something had changed. Her face had that particular quality of someone who'd just received news that required thinking about. "Everything okay?" he asked. Yes, maybe. I don't know." She held an envelope, official looking. Can we talk? You and Sienna both?" They gathered in the living room, and Faye sat forward in her chair, the envelope resting on her knees, like something that might explode if handled wrong. "I got a job offer," she said without preamble. "My old principal tracked me down. The special education position I left 3 years ago, the teacher who replaced me, is retiring. They want me back. Full tenure-track benefits, retirement contribution, substantial raise from what I was making before." Wyatt felt his stomach drop, but kept his face neutral. That's good news, is it?" Faye looked between them. "I don't know if it is. What does the job mean to you?" Sienna asked, her voice careful. "It was my identity for 15 years. I was good at it, really good. Those kids, the ones everyone else found too difficult, too challenging, I understood them, made a difference in their lives." She opened the envelope, pulled out the letter. "They need an answer by Monday. 5 days. Vermont," Wyatt said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, back to where I came from. Back to the house I still own, but haven't lived in since my husband died. Back to the job I loved but couldn't face after losing him." The silence stretched. Wyatt wanted to say something, wanted to ask her to stay, to choose this uncertain new thing over the security of an established life. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind fear and fairness and the terrible knowledge that he had no right to ask her to give up something real for something that might not work out. "What do you want to do?" Sienna asked when Wyatt couldn't. "I don't know." Faye's voice cracked slightly. 3 weeks ago I would have said yes immediately. Teaching was who I was. But now, Wyatt managed. "Now I'm not sure I'm that person anymore. I'm not sure going back is moving forward or just hiding in a different way." The day passed in a fog of normalcy that felt anything but normal. Faye spent time alone, walking the property, sitting on the porch with her journal. Wyatt tried to work on his accounting but couldn't focus, numbers blurring on the screen. Sienna baked bread, Caroline's recipe again, and the cabin filled with the smell of yeast and warmth, but it couldn't quite dispel the tension. At dinner, they attempted conversation, but kept circling back to the unspoken thing, sitting between them, like an unwelcome guest. "You should take it," Wyatt heard himself say, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to speak them. "If it's a good job, with security and benefits and work you love, you should take it." Faye set down her fork carefully. "Is that what you want?" "It's not about what I want. It's about what's right for your life. Wyatt, I won't ask you to stay. I can't. That wouldn't be fair." The hurt that flashed across Faye's face was immediate and raw. "Fair? You think what's fair is pretending you don't care either way?" "I didn't say I don't care. You didn't say you do either." She stood, her chair scraping against wood. "I need some air." She left through the back door, and Wyatt sat there feeling like he'd just failed some crucial test without understanding the question. "Dad!" Sienna's voice was sharp with frustration. "What are you doing?" "Giving her space to make the right choice. You're protecting yourself. You're so afraid of being hurt again that you won't even fight for what you want. I don't want to manipulate her decision. Telling someone how you feel isn't manipulation. It's honesty." Sienna stood too, her eyes bright with anger and tears. "Mom died 7 years ago. 7 years you've been alone, been safe, been careful. And the first time something good walks into your life, you're ready to let it walk right back out because it's easier than risking your heart. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You think you're being noble, but you're just being a coward." She left him sitting there, and Wyatt stared at his plate, at the food gone cold, at the life he'd so carefully constructed around absence and safety. Sienna was right, and he knew it. But knowing and doing were different countries, separated by an ocean of fear. He found Faye, an hour later, sitting on the fallen log near the tree line where they'd relocated the bird's nest. She didn't look up when he approached, but she didn't tell him to leave either. "I'm sorry," Wyatt said, sitting beside her with careful distance between them. "Sienna's right. I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of losing again. Of caring about someone and having them taken away. Of being that broken again." He forced himself to continue. "After Caroline died, I barely functioned for a year. Sienna had to come home from college, take care of me because I couldn't take care of myself. I swore I'd never be that vulnerable again, never need someone that much. So you've been alone instead, safe instead." "Or so I thought." Faye finally looked at him. "I'm scared too, Wyatt. My husband died suddenly. One minute he was fine, the next he was gone. No warning, no preparation. Just over. I've spent 3 years running because staying still meant facing the possibility of settling somewhere, caring about someone, building a life that could be destroyed in an instant. But teaching is safe," she interrupted. "It's what I knew before. But going back means admitting the last 3 years were just running away. Means returning to a house full of ghosts and memories and all the grief I tried to drive away from. And staying means risking everything on something uncertain. Means building something new with someone I've known for 2 weeks. Means being brave in a way I'm not sure I can be." Her voice dropped. "But when I think about getting in my truck and driving away from here, my chest hurts. And I don't know if that means I should stay, or if I'm just confusing comfort with something deeper." Wyatt reached for her hand, held it carefully. "I don't want you to go. I should have said that immediately, clearly, without hesitation. I don't want you to go, and if you stay, I promise to actually try. Not just exist beside you, but build something with you. Whatever that looks like. But," Faye's eyes searched his face, "but I also don't want you to give up something real and secure for something that might not work. That wouldn't be fair to you. Let me decide what's fair to me." They sat in the gathering darkness, hands linked, both terrified and both hoping. Finally Faye spoke. "I need a few days. To think, really think, about who I am now and what I actually want. Not what makes sense, not what's safe, but what I want. Okay? And you need to figure out if you're ready to actually let someone in. Really in. Because I can't do halfway, Wyatt. I've been halfway for 3 years, and it's killing me slowly. I understand." But as they walked back to the cabin under stars that offered no answers, Wyatt wondered if he did understand, if he could be what she needed, if he could risk everything again after spending 7 years building walls around his heart. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of time, like living inside a held breath. Faye spent hours walking, journaling, sitting alone on the porch with coffee gone cold. She was polite at meals, present but distant, working through something internal that Wyatt could only respect from afar. Wyatt found himself in his workshop, a small shed behind the cabin where Caroline's tools still hung on the wall, mostly unused since her death. He'd never been good with his hands in that way, but Faye had taught him basics over the past 2 weeks. Measuring, cutting, sanding. Simple things that added up to something whole. He decided to make something for her. Not as persuasion or bribe, but as proof. Proof that he'd learned, that he could build things now, that he was different than he'd been before she arrived. A bird, carved from cedar scraps left over from the roof. Small enough to fit in a palm, wings spread like it was caught mid-flight. Sienna found him on Friday afternoon, bent over the workbench with a carving knife and a pile of wood shavings at his feet. "What are you making?" she asked. "Probably a mess." But he held up the bird, rough and unfinished. "It's supposed to be, I don't know. A gift maybe, or an apology, or a promise. It's sweet, Dad." She picked up sandpaper, handed it to him. "Here, smooth the edges. Birds shouldn't have sharp corners." They worked together in comfortable silence, Sienna offering guidance when he got stuck, Wyatt's hands slowly learning what they needed to do. The bird emerged gradually from the wood, imperfect, absolutely, but recognizable, real. "She might leave anyway," Sienna said quietly. "I know, but at least you'll know you tried. Is that enough?" "It has to be." Sienna touched the bird's wing gently. "You can't control what other people choose, Dad. You can only control what you offer them. And this," she gestured at the carving, at him, at the workshop he'd finally entered, "this is real. This matters." That evening, Faye asked to speak with both of them after dinner. The formality of it sent Wyatt's stomach into knots, but he nodded, and they gathered in the living room like they had 2 days ago, except this time Faye didn't sit. She stood by the fireplace, gathering words. "I need to tell you both the whole story," she began. "About why I left Vermont. About the last 3 years." Wyatt started to say she didn't owe them explanations, but she held up a hand. "I do. I need to say this out loud. For myself, if nothing else." So they listened. Faye told them about the morning her husband died, how they'd argued about something stupid, whether to replace the kitchen cabinets or just refinish them. How her last words to him had been irritated, distracted. How he'd kissed her anyway, said he loved her anyway, walked out the door to a job site and collapsed 4 hours later, dead before the ambulance arrived. She told them about the funeral, about returning to the house they'd renovated together, about the teaching job she'd loved suddenly feeling impossible. Every child a reminder of the children they'd never have. Every staff meeting another hour, sitting in a chair where he'd never sit again. "I sold everything," she said. "Furniture, his tools, everything except what fit in my truck. I kept the house because I couldn't face selling it, but I haven't been back in 3 years. Just paid someone to check on it occasionally, keep the pipes from freezing. And you've been traveling since then," Wyatt said. "Running," Faye corrected. "I've been running. Town to town, job to job. Never staying long enough to get attached, to care, to risk feeling that kind of loss again." She looked at them both. "Until here. Until you two. Until I started to remember what home felt like." "What changed?" Sienna asked. "I did. Or maybe I just got tired of running. Maybe I finally understood that you can't outrun grief. It follows you everywhere. So you either let it swallow you whole, or you learn to carry it and keep moving forward anyway." Faye pulled the job offer letter from her pocket, looked at it like it was a map to a country she'd already left. "This job, it's everything I thought I wanted when I started traveling. Security, purpose, a return to who I was before. But I'm not that person anymore. I can't go back to that house and pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. Can't pretend I'm the same woman who fled from grief instead of facing it. So what will you do?" Wyatt's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet, but I know what I don't want." She set the letter on the mantel. "I don't want to keep running. I don't want to choose safety over living. I don't want to be 60 years old looking back and wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay." Wyatt stood, his legs shaky but holding. "I need to tell you something too. I've been alone for 7 years, and I've called it healing when really it was just hiding. I've built this small, careful life where nothing can hurt me because nothing can reach me. And you," his voice caught, "you reached me anyway. Wyatt, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "I'm 52 years old. I'm an accountant who can barely hammer a nail straight. I have a daughter who's still figuring out her own life, a cabin that's always going to need something fixed, and more emotional baggage than any reasonable person should want to take on. But if you're willing, if you can see past all of that, I'd like to try building something real with you. Here, together." The silence that followed felt enormous. Faye's eyes were bright with tears, her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding herself together. "I need to sleep on it," she said finally. "I need one more night to be absolutely certain. Because if I say yes, if I stay, I need to know I'm doing it for the right reasons. Not because I'm afraid or because it's easier than going back, but because it's what I genuinely want. That's fair. Is it?" Faye's smile was sad. "Nothing about this feels fair. It feels terrifying and reckless and possibly the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years." She left them then, retiring to her room early. Sienna hugged Wyatt hard. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you for trying. That night, Wyatt finished the carved bird, sanded it smooth, rubbed oil into the wood until it glowed. It wasn't perfect. One wing was slightly larger than the other. The tail feathers weren't quite symmetrical, but it was honest. Made with his own hands, his own effort, his own hope. He set it on his nightstand and stared at it until sleep finally came. Fitful and full of dreams, he couldn't quite remember when morning arrived. Saturday dawned clear and bright, the day of the community dance. The day Faye had promised an answer. The day everything would change one way or another. Wyatt made coffee with shaking hands and waited for the sun to rise. Wyatt woke before dawn, his heart already racing, though he hadn't moved. Saturday, the day of answers. He lay in bed, listening to the cabin's familiar sounds, wood settling, wind in the pines, the distant call of an early bird. Sounds that had been his entire world for 7 years and might return to being his only company by evening. He rose, dressed, made coffee. Through the window, he saw Faye's truck still parked in its usual spot, and his chest loosened slightly. She hadn't left in the night. That was something. When he walked into the kitchen, he found her bags by the door. His heart stopped. She was leaving. She'd made her decision, and it was Vermont, security, the known world over this uncertain new thing they'd barely begun. He stood there frozen, coffee cup halfway to his lips, and felt the familiar numbness start to creep in, the protective shell he'd worn for 7 years beginning to reform. "Wyatt?" He turned. Faye stood in the doorway to the guest room, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing one of the flannel shirts she favored for work. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something he couldn't quite read. "I see your bags are packed," he said, and his voice came out flat, defensive. "Yes." She walked into the kitchen, poured herself coffee with steady hands. "I stayed up most of the night thinking. Made a list of pros and cons, like some kind of decision matrix. Tried to be logical about it. And logic kept pointing me back to Vermont. Established career, financial security, a house I already own, work I know I'm good at. On paper, it's the obvious choice." Wyatt nodded, not trusting himself to speak. This was it, then. The end of something before it had really begun. But then I thought about what my husband used to say. Faye's voice softened. He'd tell me that the heart knows things the head can't calculate. That the best decisions he ever made looked stupid on paper, but felt right in his gut. She set down her coffee, crossed the distance between them, and Wyatt's breath caught. "I packed my bags because I need to drive to town today, get the rest of my things from storage. Because," she pulled a folded paper from her pocket, "I emailed the principal last night. Declined the offer." The words didn't immediately make sense. Wyatt stared at her, processing, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. "You what?" "I'm not going back to Vermont. I'm staying here." Her smile was tentative but real. "If you'll still have me. Not in your cabin. I need my own space, at least to start. But nearby, close enough to see where this goes. Faye." It was all he could manage, her name emerging like a prayer. "I'm done running, Wyatt. Done letting fear make my decisions. Teaching was who I was, but it's not who I am now. These past 3 years on the road, I learned I'm good at building things. Maybe it's time I build a life instead of just fixing other people's roofs. But the security, the benefits, I'll figure it out. I'm a good carpenter. I can start a business here, take on local projects. It won't be easy, but easy hasn't made me happy." She reached out, touched his face gently. "You make me happy. This place makes me happy. Sienna makes me happy. And I'm tired of choosing safety over joy." Wyatt set down his coffee before he dropped it, pulled her close, held her like she might dissolve if he let go. She held him back just as tightly, and they stood there in the morning light, 2 people who'd been broken finding wholeness in each other. "I made you something," Wyatt said finally, pulling back just enough to see her face. "It's not much. It's probably terrible, actually. But..." He retrieved the carved bird from his bedroom, brought it back, placed it in her hands. They looked at it, turned it over carefully, traced the imperfect wings with one finger. "You made this? With what you taught me? It's rough, I know, but I wanted you to have something that proved I can learn. I can change. I can build things if someone shows me how." Faye's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful." It's crooked. It's perfect. She closed her hand around it, held it to her chest. Thank you for this. But for being willing to try, are you sure? Wyatt needed to ask, needed to give her one more chance to reconsider. About staying? About all of it? More sure than I've been about anything in 5 years. She kissed him then, soft and certain, and Wyatt felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 7 years finally. Fully thaw. When they broke apart, Sienna was standing in the doorway, grinning through happy tears. "So I guess this means you're staying?" she asked Faye. "If that's okay with you." "It's more than okay." Sienna crossed to them, wrapped them both in a hug. "It's perfect." "You're perfect. This whole weird, unexpected thing is perfect." They stood together, the three of them, and Wyatt thought about Caroline. Sent her a silent message of gratitude for the life they'd built, the daughter they'd raised, the love she'd taught him was possible, and for whatever cosmic benevolence had sent Faye Calloway down his driveway at exactly the right moment. "So what happens now?" Faye asked. "Now," Sienna said, releasing them, "we find you a place in town. Something with space for a workshop, maybe. Close enough that you can come over for dinner, but far enough that you're not living in each other's pockets." "Practical and romantic," Faye said, laughing. "I like it. And tonight," Wyatt added, finding his voice and his courage simultaneously, "we go to that dance. As a proper date." As he looked at Faye, really looked at her, as people who are figuring this out together. "I'd like that." They spent the morning calling about rentals, making plans, talking about next steps, with the easy excitement of people who'd stopped fighting their own happiness. Mrs. Kerrigan called. Somehow she'd already heard about Faye staying, and offered to spread the word about a new carpentry business in town. "You'll have more work than you can handle," she promised. "Everyone around here has something that needs fixing." By afternoon, they'd found a small cottage on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, a shed that could be converted to a workshop, a porch that faced the mountains. The owner could have it ready by the end of the week. "It's not much," the landlord said apologetically. "It's perfect," Faye corrected, and squeezed Wyatt's hand. As they drove back to the cabin, Wyatt felt lighter than he had in years. Scared still, yes. Fear didn't just disappear because you made a brave choice. But hopeful too. Actually genuinely hopeful. "Thank you," he said to Faye as they pulled into the drive. "For what?" "For choosing this. For choosing—" He paused, found the courage. "For choosing me. Thank you for being worth choosing." The weeks that followed felt like watching time-lapse photography of a garden growing. Things that should have taken months seemed to happen in fast-forward, propelled by momentum and purpose, and the simple fact that all three of them had stopped resisting and started building. Faye moved into the cottage on a Thursday. Wyatt and Sienna helped, driving a small U-Haul from the storage facility 2 towns over where she'd kept her life in boxes for 3 years. Unpacking revealed the artifacts of her previous existence. Photo albums, her husband's favorite coffee mug, teaching awards, furniture that had once filled a house she'd fled from. "I thought this would be harder," Faye said, unwrapping a framed picture of her and her late husband on their wedding day. "Young faces, endless hope. Looking at all this again." "Is it?" Sienna asked gently. "No, it's okay. He was real. We were real. That doesn't go away just because I'm building something new." She set the photo on the mantel, positioned it carefully. "He'd like you both, I think. He always said I needed people who'd call me on my nonsense." "We can definitely do that," Wyatt said, and Faye laughed. The cottage transformed over days. Faye hung her tools in the shed-turned-workshop, organized her supplies with the precision of someone who'd spent years working from the back of a truck and relished having actual space. She painted the bedroom a warm sage green, hung curtains, made the place hers. But she was at Wyatt's cabin more often than not. Dinners stretched into evenings, evenings into nights spent talking on the porch or playing guitar or simply existing in comfortable silence. They moved slowly, deliberately, learning each other's rhythms, boundaries, hopes. A kiss goodnight, held hands during walks. The physical intimacy of people who'd already lived full lives and didn't need to rush. Sienna found a job at a local non-profit that worked with at-risk youth. Nothing fancy, nothing like her marketing career in the city, but it felt right. She started taking photographs again. Mountain landscapes, wildlife, the small moments of daily life. Posted some online and was surprised when people wanted to buy prints. "I forgot I could make things," she told Faye one afternoon, the two of them sorting through Sienna's photos on the cottage porch. "I'd gotten so caught up in selling other people's visions that I stopped having my own." "Easy trap to fall into," Faye said. "But you're finding your way back." "So are you. So is Dad. We're all—" Sienna paused, searching for words. "We're all becoming ourselves again. Better versions, maybe." Faye's carpentry business took off faster than any of them expected. Mrs. Kerrigan made good on her promise, spreading word through the community with the efficiency of a military operation. Soon Faye was booked solid. Deck repairs, custom furniture, a complete kitchen renovation for a family 3 valleys over. Wyatt helped where he could, handling the business side. Invoices, scheduling taxes. His accounting skills merged with her craftsmanship, and they discovered they worked together as well professionally as they did personally. One Saturday, 6 weeks after Faye had decided to stay, they worked together on a project of their own. A sign for the cottage. Simple wood, rooted letters, nothing fancy. But they designed it together, built it together, each contributing their particular skills. "What should it say?" Faye asked, pencil hovering over the design sketch. "Home," Wyatt said without hesitation. "Just home." They carved and sanded and finished it together, then hung it beside the cottage door. Faye stood back looking at it, and Wyatt saw her eyes shine with tears she didn't bother hiding. "First real home I've had in 3 years," she said. "First real home I've felt in 7, Wyatt replied. That evening they threw a small gathering. Nothing elaborate, just Sienna, Mrs. Kerrigan, a few neighbors, some of Faye's new clients. Simple food, acoustic music, conversation that flowed easy as water. Mrs. Kerrigan cornered Wyatt by the makeshift bar, lemonade and iced tea, nothing stronger. "You did good, Wyatt Brenner," she said, nodding toward where Faye was showing Sienna and 2 neighbors her workshop. "Your Caroline would be proud." "You think so?" "I know so. She loved you enough to want you happy, even after she was gone. That's real love, the kind that doesn't end just because a heart stops beating." Mrs. Kerrigan patted his arm with surprising strength. "You're allowed to live, you know, even after loss, especially after loss." Later, after everyone had left and Sienna had driven back to her apartment, her own place now, a studio in town, Wyatt and Faye sat on the cottage porch and watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. "This feels right," Faye said quietly. "Scary, but right." "Scary how?" "Scary, like, what if I mess this up? What if I'm not good at this? I was married for 20 years, but that was different. We were young, grew up together. Now we're older, more set in our ways. What if—" Wyatt took her hand, threaded his fingers through hers. "What if we stop asking what if and just see what happens? Is it that simple? Probably not. But maybe we can pretend it is, just for tonight." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that, while darkness claimed the valley and the temperature dropped, and the mountain air filled with the sound of wind through pine. "I love you," Faye said so quietly he almost missed it. "I didn't plan to. Didn't expect to, but I do." Wyatt's breath caught. He'd known it, felt it, but hearing the words was different, real in a way that thoughts couldn't be. "I love you too," he said, and the words came easier than he'd imagined. "I think I started loving you the day you climbed onto my roof and showed me I didn't have to do everything alone. That was only a few weeks ago. Sometimes a few weeks is enough." He turned to face her, cupped her cheek with his palm. "I wasted 7 years being safe. I'm done wasting time." She kissed him then, deep and sure, and Wyatt felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. Not broken, dissolved, no longer needed. When they finally pulled apart, Faye was smiling. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we keep building. Your business, our relationship, whatever this becomes. One day at a time, together. No grand plans? No timelines? We're too old for timelines." We know how fast everything can change. Wyatt stood, pulled her up with him. But I know I want more days like this, more evenings on this porch, more chances to learn from you and laugh with you and figure out who we are together. That sounds perfect. They went inside as the night turned cold, the sign beside the door catching moonlight. Home, it said. Simple, true, earned. Inside, in the warm glow of lamplight, two people who'd thought their chances at happiness had passed found themselves building something new, not replacing what they'd lost. Nothing could do that. But adding to it, honoring it by continuing forward. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, witnesses to human joy and sorrow alike. But inside the small cottage with its workshop and its imperfect sign, there was warmth and love and the quiet miracle of second chances. 6 months passed like water over stone, constant, gradual, shaping everything it touched. Autumn arrived in the mountains with its usual extravagance, painting the aspens gold and filling the air with wood smoke and promise. Wyatt stood on his porch on a Sunday morning in late October, coffee in hand, watching the first snow dust the peaks in the distance. The roof above him, the one that had brought Faye into his life, stood solid and weatherproof, having endured the first real storms of the season without complaint. Behind him, the cabin door opened and Faye emerged, wrapped in one of his flannel shirts over her own clothes, hair still mussed from sleep. She'd stayed over more nights than not lately, though she still maintained her cottage. They were taking it slow, but slow didn't mean uncertain. Just careful, deliberate. "Morning," she said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "Morning." He covered her hands with his free one, both of them looking out at the awakening valley. They'd fallen into routines that felt both new and ancient. Weekend breakfasts together, weekday dinners rotating between his cabin, her cottage, and increasingly Sienna's studio apartment. Work that complemented rather than competed. Wyatt handling the business side of Faye's growing carpentry operation while maintaining his own accounting clients. Faye's workshop had become something of a local landmark. She'd taken on an apprentice, a young woman named Iris, who'd been drifting like Faye once had and needed direction. Watching Faye teach, seeing her patience and skill, Wyatt understood that she'd found her way back to helping people. Just differently than before. "Sienna's coming for dinner tonight," Faye said. "She's bringing someone. A someone." She was vague about it, but there was something in her voice. Wyatt smiled. His daughter had been healing in visible increments. The broken engagement that had sent her home was rarely mentioned now, processed and integrated, and no longer the defining moment of her recent history. She'd been taking photography classes online, building a small business, doing portraits and landscape work. More importantly, she'd been building a life, friends, community, purpose. Good for her, Wyatt said. She deserves happiness. So do you. Faye kissed his shoulder through the flannel. And somehow, improbably, you found it. We found it, he corrected. The day unfolded with the easy rhythm they'd established. Faye worked in her cottage workshop on a custom bookshelf order. Wyatt tackled end-of-quarter reports for his clients. They met for lunch at the small diner in town, ran into Mrs. Kerrigan, who insisted on showing them photos of her great-grandchildren and commenting loudly about how good they looked together. "When's the wedding?" she demanded. "We're taking our time," Faye said, smiling. "At your age, you don't have time to waste." "At our age," Wyatt countered gently, "we know the difference between rushing and savoring." Mrs. Kerrigan harumphed, but couldn't quite hide her approval. That evening, Sienna arrived with her someone, a quiet man named Adrian, who taught geology at the community college and had kind eyes and steady hands. They'd met when Sienna had been photographing rock formations for a local tourism campaign, and he'd stopped to explain the sedimentary layers with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his subject. Over pot roast, Caroline's recipe again, but made by all four of them working together in the cabin's kitchen, they talked and laughed and told stories. Adrian fit into the evening like he'd always been there, asking thoughtful questions, listening more than he spoke, clearly enchanted by Sienna. After dinner, Faye brought out her guitar, and they gathered on the porch despite the chill. She played and they sang, imperfectly but joyfully, old songs and new ones, harmonies finding themselves without effort. Watching his daughter lean against Adrian, seeing the easy affection between them, Wyatt felt his heart expand. She'd been so broken when she'd come home. They'd all been broken in their different ways, but somehow, together, they'd found ways to heal. After Sienna and Adrian left, Faye and Wyatt cleaned up together, moving around each other with the practiced ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. "She's happy," Faye observed, drying the last plate. "She is, because she saw us figuring it out and knew it was possible. Think we've figured it out?" "I think we're figuring it out. Present tense, ongoing." Wyatt hung up the dish towel, turned to face her. "And I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "For more, he took a breath. "For asking you to marry me, eventually, when it feels right. Not today necessarily, but—" Faye laughed, pulled him close. "Are you proposing or thinking about proposing?" "Thinking about it. Out loud, with you, because that's what we do. We figure things out together. I love that about us." She kissed him softly. "And yes, eventually, when it feels right. I'd like that very much." They moved to the porch, bundled in blankets against the autumn chill, and sat in the rocking chairs Caroline had loved. Above them, the repaired roof stood strong. Around them, the mountains held their eternal watch. And between them, something precious and hard-won glowed steady as candlelight. "You know what I realized," Faye said after a long, comfortable silence. "What's that?" "That storm that tore your roof apart. It felt like the worst thing at the time, but it brought me here, brought us together. Sometimes things have to break before better things can be built." Caroline used to say something similar, that the universe provides what you need, even if it's not what you wanted. Smart woman, the smartest. She'd like you, you know. You're both, he searched for the right word, both the kind of people who fix things, who make things better just by being present. I'd like to think I would have liked her too. They sat until the cold drove them inside, until the cabin wrapped around them with its familiar warmth. Faye gathered her things to head back to her cottage. She had an early job tomorrow, but paused at the door. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting me stay, for being brave enough to try, for showing me that home isn't a place you return to. It's something you build with people who see you. Thank you for climbing onto my roof that day, for being patient with a stubborn man who didn't know how to accept help. We're quite a pair. We really are." After she left, Wyatt stood in his cabin and looked around. Same walls, same floors, same furniture Caroline had chosen all those years ago. But different now, not haunted by absence, but enriched by memory. Not a museum to what was lost, but a foundation for what was being built. He thought about the scared, broken man he'd been 6 months ago, the one who'd nearly fallen off a roof because he couldn't admit he needed help. The one who'd spent 7 years surviving instead of living. That man was gone, not erased but transformed, integrated into someone new, someone who knew how to hold grief and joy in the same heart, who understood that loving again didn't diminish. What came before, who'd learned that the best things in life often arrive unexpectedly and require courage to keep. Outside, in the tree near the cabin, the bird's nest they'd relocated still held a family. The eggs had hatched, the chicks had grown, and now new birds were building something of their own in the same spot. Life continuing, adapting, persisting. Wyatt turned off the lights and headed to bed, and as he drifted towards sleep, he thought about tomorrow, about the work he'd do, the person he'd see, the life he was building one careful, intentional day at a time. Sometimes the hardest thing to rebuild isn't a broken roof, he thought, echoing the words that had started this journey. It's a broken heart, but with patience, with help, with courage enough to try, anything can be rebuilt. Anything can be made whole again. Not the same as before, but strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. And that, Wyatt knew as sleep claimed him, was more than enough. It was everything.